Our next panel, Tehran's Tentacles, the Islamic Republic's War in the Middle East, will analyze the regime's destabilizing activities and strategic alliances in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen. Joining us for this panel are David Schenker, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute, Robert Greenway, Director at the Heritage Foundation's Center for National Defense, Michael Pregent, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, and this panel is moderated by Elina Shirazi, correspondent at News Nation. Please join us in welcoming our speakers.
Good morning, everybody. So this is going to be a very spirited discussion. We're going to talk about Tehran's tentacles, and that's really a perfect description for this discussion, for this panel, because, of course, Iran really has widespread reach throughout the Middle East, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, as well as in Lebanon. So this is not just about Iran. This is about the power and reach that Iran has in destabilizing the Middle East. We have some great panelists here with us, some speakers here today who have a lot of experience in both domestic and foreign policy as well. I know you were just saying you just got back from Israel as well, so you were just there. You really know what's going on the ground. So I want to start off first with the first question here. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has expanded Iran's influence in different ways and methods. So first question for you gentlemen, how do their activities destabilize the region? I'm hoping David, if you want to start us off, can take this one.
Yeah, are we on? Thank you. Technically challenged. Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here with you today, with all of you, and with my esteemed colleagues. Listen, Iran, there are very few benefits of authoritarian regimes, but one of them clearly is that you can execute policy over a long term without regard to political changes, without regard to democratic voting. Iran, the United States changes its policies every 4 years or every 8 years. Iran can have a policy that lasts decades. And so they can plan strategically and they can carry out and execute policy, not do 180-degree turns, et cetera. So what Iran has done, essentially, what the regime has done, is to plant militia throughout the region. Early on, in the early 80s, they started with Hezbollah. They cultivated, grew, developed Hezbollah that grew into what it is today. They saw, they were able to foresee the power and benefit of these proxies and cultivated others, whether this is in the Houthis in Yemen, whether this is the Hashid in Iraq. More recently, Hezbollah took decades to grow, but these organizations, I think, were on the fast track. They had lessons learned. And they support and provide not only weapons and funding, but it is really the know-how, knowledge transfer. And so they've been incredibly, unfortunately, successful at doing this, and it is quite effective.
Would you say it's taking advantage of the sort of gray zones in some of these countries?
Yeah, I mean, they do better in failed or failing states. They do better in states that have Shia populations, a little bit more susceptible or welcoming to this. They have tried to do things in Jordan. It's difficult for them because it's a 96% Sunni population, 3%. They don't provide visas for the Iranian regime or people they send in. But yeah, I think part of it is the environment in which they're operating in. If you look at Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, these are all basically failed states.
Right, and that's the sectarian divide, right, between the Shia and the Sunnis and how they're taking advantage of that. Thank you. Any other thoughts on that question? Okay. I see you deep nodding over there.
I just showed you how to do it. So thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on this panel with Rob and David. All I would say about this is it's ungoverned spaces, right? It's places where the Islamic Republic of Iran is able, through proxies and through friends, to be able to expand their influence. And I think the frustration that the three of us have the most is that we seem to facilitate this with our policies. The United States builds institutions to counter Iran that end up being co-opted by the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the most recent example is, since October 7th, I think across the political spectrum, we have come to the realization that we cannot rely on the Iraqi military that we built, that we trained, that we fund to take on the Hashd al-Shabi, to take on the militias. And nobody has even made the ask of the Lebanese armed forces to do anything about what's going on south of the Litani line. And those are two US failures in policy. And it's always touted as, we're building institutions to counter Iran, and they end up being co-opted. And that's one of the biggest frustrations.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on that. So this panel is, really focusing on the proxy groups that Iran is continuing to build and fund. So of course we have to talk about sanctions. That's a very big topic. So despite these sanctions, Iran continues to fund these proxy groups. So how effective have sanctions been so far, and what alternative measures could the international community really put into place to sort of fight this? So I think I'll have Robert take this away, if you will, if your microphone works.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. And first, thanks to Nafdeed and to distinguished colleagues on the panel for participating today. I told Cameron, my good friend up front, that I'm pessimistic in the near term, but optimistic because in large part of what this organization represents and what it's trying to do. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. On sanctions first, I think the important point to build off what my friends and colleagues have stated, it's critical to deny resources to the Islamic Republic and the proxies and surrogates which they employ. And it's normally looked at as de minimis, a small relative amount of funds, but it's not zero, and it's essential to their survival, and it is tantamount to command and control. So the question always is, to what extent does the Islamic Republic of Iran control its proxies? And it comes down to, as it often does in the Middle East, the degree to which they provide resources. The more resources you provide, the more control you have implicit over that organization. The less you provide, the less control you have. Incumbent upon the United States to do so. Number two, historically, the application of sanctions by the United States against the Islamic Republic, and there is a storied past, many of you, all of you are doubtless familiar with it, has been predicated on the economic pressure applied. It has ebbed and flowed. But there's no question that successful negotiation, however flawed, deeply flawed, the JCPOA was, everyone, including the Supreme Leader, admit that the application of sanctions was an essential ingredient to behavior change. It was a precondition that pressure ultimately does in fact have an impact. Number three, in the Trump administration, those of us that were fortunate enough to participate in it applied historic pressure on the Islamic Republic, and as a result, I think, managed to dry up the resources. When Hezbollah, when Hassan Nasrallah is asking its members to consider donating organs to raise funds, you know that you've applied historic pressure. There's no better measure than that. And you could gauge it, right? In the beginning, going from, as I did, DOD into the White House in the Trump administration, every day I was reading about what Qasem Soleimani and what the IRGC were doing to conduct operations and activities against the U.S. interests, our partners and allies. By the time we transitioned, I was reading about how they were trying to figure out how to make ends meet, how to get enough money, how to build a parallel organization to acquire, manage, and distribute resources, and it wasn't working. That's, I think, the goal. And so the last thing I would say on sanctions are, they're like arrest warrants. They serve a critical purpose, but unenforced, they are horribly ineffective. And they can be. In the case of the Islamic Republic, we're looking at now 1.7 million barrels a day being exported, probably more if you include the illicit and concealed trade. That's a record, and it's being done, as you know, about $80 a barrel. Everyone here who has to fill up their car knows just how high it was. We got them down to about 400,000 barrels a day, on average, at again, Brent crude at 55 or less barrels per day, a significant difference. And look, the $100 billion revenue surplus they've experienced under the Biden-Harris administration is equivalent to the two highest years of their entire defense budget. 2 years of their entire defense budget in surplus has been provided in just the last 3.5 years. What can you do with that money? Well, you can build a nuclear weapon, you can build a delivery system, and you can threaten the region and the U.S. and its interests with surrogates and proxies. So sanctions are critical, they can be effective, they have to be enforced.
It seems like you both are of the same mind on that.
Yeah, I view them as necessary, but insufficient. They're part, it's one of the many tools of national power. And I think we have relied too often on just the economic lever rather than the military instrument or diplomacy, particularly the military instrument. Iran is out there attacking the United States and its partners every day. And we are really reticent to use force. I'm not talking about whacking the regime. They hit us in the gray zone, right, through operations that don't have fingerprints, right, or through their proxies, et cetera. There are things we can do, and I think we are just, unfortunately, I think a little shy about using all the tools of national power.
Maximum pressure was so effective that Iran is now trying to find bypass mechanisms, other currencies to use so that they won't come under threat of future U.S. sanctions. And once we lose the ability to punish economically and only have the kinetic option, then we lose the ability to use diplomacy to put a lot of these things down. So our enemies are navigating and circumventing our smart power and soft power, and we're letting it happen. Just like Rob said, you know, every day the administration will say, there are new sanctions on the Islamic Republic of Iran, and then we'll all look at each other and say, but they're not going to enforce them. This is for U.S. public consumption only. It doesn't matter there. And when you're asking not only to donate organs, but when you're asking the Houthis to raise money for you, when Nasrallah is asking the Houthis to raise money for you, that means maximum pressure was working, and we need to get back to those days. I think the regime would have collapsed had there been a second Trump administration. I think one of the other things we need to look at when it comes to maximum pressure on Iran is to not give Turkey a carve-out, not to give Iran a carve-out, not to not to hold back on secondary sanctions on Russia and China when it comes to the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Just one quick point to build off what David said, and wholeheartedly agree. The military instrument is the second necessary ingredient that has historically brought about significant behavior change and compromise in the Islamic Republic. Just a point of comparison that I brought up yesterday, because we're looking now at active threats against a former president of the United States. It's been going on for some time. It's just now come to, I think, more public attention. Compare this with 1993, when then Democratic former President George H.W. Bush was in Kuwait, and an attempt against his life by Iraqi intelligence service was thwarted. And a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, ordered 43 Tomahawk missiles to destroy the Iraqi intelligence headquarters in downtown Baghdad in 2 months. Is a very different response taken surgically, directly against the organizations responsible. Compare and contrast that with what now is taking place, the absence of the willingness to use the military instrument.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Obviously, sanctions is a really big topic, and a continuing conversation here with U.S. policy as well. So I want to talk about Hezbollah and Lebanon, right? So Iran reportedly provides Hezbollah with around $700 million per year, influencing Lebanon's political landscape. So how does this financial support impact Lebanon, as well as its relationship with neighboring countries? Michael, if you want to start this off.
I'm going to pass that to this man right here, and then I'll follow up.
So there's a question of how they get the money, or?
How is Iran, what is Iran's influence really in Lebanon with Hezbollah?
Listen, Iran is the Islamic Republic is the sovereign over Lebanon. The Lebanese government is irrelevant. The Lebanese military is irrelevant. In fact, the Lebanese military, whether via intimidation or threat, basically has a collaborative arrangement with Hezbollah. And so they have built this organization from the ground up. It has become, I think, relatively speaking, a more potent force than almost all of the Arab armies in the region. It is a remarkable trajectory. The organization is not 10 feet tall. Israel is doing, I think, what is a pretty remarkable job of degrading the command and control of the organization, key personnel, and missile. But no, this is the Iranian regime's baby. It is their #1 asset. And the organization itself, Hezbollah, was not designed to fight Israel. It was designed actually to be a deterrent against Israel attacking the regime or the regime's nuclear program. And so this is why we see that, regardless of what you think about what's going on in Gaza, Hamas requested that Hezbollah intervene on their behalf and expressed profound disappointment that Hezbollah did not really engage in a fight against Israel, but rather engaged in performative resistance after October 7th, because that's not Hezbollah's mission. It's neither to defend the Palestinians nor liberate Lebanese territory, but to defend Iran.
I think what's interesting right now about what's going on with Hezbollah and Hamas, the IDF can handle Hamas. It's not a problem. The only problem Israel has when it comes to Hamas is the public relations fight, the media fight, and with Western governments who want to deny it offensive weapons, or a U.S. domestic audience that believes in the terms of genocide and these things that just aren't happening. Just real quick on the Hamas numbers, the 40,000 civilians that they say were killed by the Israelis in Gaza, 19,000 of them are Hamas or Islamic Jihad. And then in a population of 2.1 million, there are natural deaths that occur in a year, and that's at 8,000. So you could subtract those numbers from the 40,000, and you get it's sad that civilians are being killed, but is the gold standard for combatant to civilian ratio in history, especially in modern urban combat. And Iran is putting so much pressure on its friends here in the US and the West to put pressures on Western governments to tell Israel to stop so that Hamas can survive, so that Yahya Sinwar can survive. So that's a big problem for the regime. But the regime did not expect for Hezbollah to take these kind of losses. And no matter how much money the regime is pouring in, the launchers are being struck. They have more rockets than launchers now. The launchers are being targeted. And this brilliant attack using the communication systems for Hamas, a lot of people don't know that Iran is the reason Israel was able to do this, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Because Iran, the regime, provided new communications gear to Hezbollah that Israel intercepted during that supply chain. And if you look at the targeted strike, we heard the UN, condemn Israel's use of terrorism to go after a terrorist group. They were able to target key leaders at every level down to the platoon level. So if you look at Hezbollah as a 100,000-man force, and you compare that to a U.S. Army division of about 10,000 people, you would need 300 successful strikes inside of that U.S. Army division to basically degrade its military capabilities down to the platoon level, a fractured platoon level. And this is different than whack-a-mole, right? If you kill a leader, somebody else replaces it. This strike injured leaders that would have replaced the next leader, that would have replaced the leader after that. So the leadership all the way down was either injured, blinded, or killed, to include over 100 Revolutionary Guard Corps advisors. So this strike was the equivalent of taking out the command and control all the way down to the platoon level across 10 U.S. Army divisions simultaneously. And Iran did not expect that. And now you have future Hezbollah commanders that are not going to answer their cell phones, that are not going to use pagers, that are going to be worried about using radios. And that is brilliant, and Israel's not getting credit for that. And it's going to be a great movie in about 10 years.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, David, as well. Iran's baby, I think it's a key word there with, one of the key proxies from Iran as well. So now can we talk about Yemen, Iran's role in Yemen? We know Iran's support for the Houthi rebels has, of course, escalated the conflict in Yemen. It's created a humanitarian crisis, which is what this is really all about. It's about the people, bottom line. So what strategies can the international community use to address Iran's role and seek peace in Yemen? I'm looking at you, David.
So I'll defer perhaps to Rob on this. I'm sure he's got some ideas. Let me start out by saying, obviously colossal mistake of the Biden administration to remove the Houthis from the sanctions list, to delist the Houthis after we had designated them at the end of the Trump administration. But really, I think what's happened in the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb really represents sort of a break with, I want to say 150 years of U.S. policy, where the United States basically guaranteed freedom of navigation, kept sea lanes open. This is something we have traditionally done. How long has that been, Rob? 100 years, 150?
Oh, at least.
Yeah. And we have basically walked away from this because it's difficult, or because we don't want to devote the resources to this, because we want a de-escalation. The problem's not going to go away, right? After the war in Gaza is over, we will still see the Houthis, the proxy of Iran, controlling access to Bab el-Mandeb, the Red Sea. And in fact, Iran, the theocratic regime there, now controls the two key energy choke points in the world, right? With the Bab el-Mandeb and the Straits of Hormuz, right? It's unlikely, but I think quite striking development. But this is yet another proxy that has been well armed, and is it in itself, I think, a very innovative, highly ideological organization. And Iran had inroads because, of course, these are ideological fellow travelers in many ways, and while not Shiite, they are Zaidi, and which is perhaps close enough.
So I agree with David's comments completely. I'd say first, why it matters. The principle of maintaining freedom of navigation, critically important. We obviously, the United States trades. That's one of the principal benefits and the pillars of our economy. But second, it's 26% of the world's trade. And as a result, it impacts the global economy, not just our own. It's chiefly east-west trade, so Asia to Europe. But again, as long as we buy and sell, the impact on containerized traffic, the price of a 40-foot container, and insurance, et cetera, we're looking at a 260% increase there. It's about a 20% global increase in commodity costs just because of this individual disruption. Number one, so we can't avoid it. It does matter, the principle as well as the practical result of it. Second, the strategy that the Trump administration previously applied, approved by the president in September 2017, announced in October, included the application of the military instrument against the axis of resistance. And I'll say, frankly, we had difficulty convincing the government to apply pretty much anything, but certainly this. And it was supposed to begin, really, on the peninsula and in Yemen, because the theory was it's the least impact that the Islamic Republic had. It was the nascent formation of its militia groups. It is the furthest, the most challenging to supply, maintain, and support. And they had not, had sufficient time as they've had in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Iraq, or in Gaza, or in the Judea and Samaria and the West Bank. And so the principle was you could, at low cost, low risk, obtain the highest impact and begin the process. We had enormous resistance to doing this for a variety of factors. We were insufficiently providing support to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who were engaged at this time, knocking on the door of Hudaydah And unfortunately, we weren't able to make progress on this. And so a small handful of individuals from the IRGC Quds Force, led by Abdul Reza Shalahi, who was effective against us in Iraq and has the blood of 603 Americans on his hand, and he's not the only one, of course. And so we missed an opportunity to do it, and we've missed it ever since. It's shocking to know that we've inserted a significant amount of resources, chiefly naval, into the region to deal with the potential response from the Islamic Republic after the death of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, embarrassingly and publicly. And yet we're not using any of that capacity to maintain and restore. And the attacks against our own ships is the highest since the Second World War, and against commercial shipping, again, having the impact I mentioned. What could be done, then, to your question? I would advise the following. The first is the denial of external resources. Nothing is made in Yemen. Let's dismiss this as a fact. Nothing is actually made in Yemen. It's assembled in Yemen, in some cases, with support and expertise provided. But the materials themselves, and I mean every material, all of it, comes from outside of Yemen. That is all chiefly maritime. There are some exceptions to it. We know this. That must be disrupted. And again, we have the forces present to do it. We're just not doing it. When was the last time you heard about a maritime interdiction? Number two, we have to apply and impose costs upon the Houthis themselves and the IRGC Quds Force in the Yemen itself. The small cadre that includes now members of Hezbollah, cost has to be imposed on that technical expertise to assemble the equipment provided. Third, the financial burden. Restore the foreign terrorist organization designation, lifted immediately by the Biden-Harris administration. Before obtaining benefits, and it's famously mocked, and it should be. And then enforce that designation. Again, they don't need a lot of money, they don't get a lot of money, but they do have external support, and it should be broadly applied. Third, we need to, again, support our partners and allies in the region and make common cause against this shared adversary. And then number four, we need to develop a ground game. It can't be done from the air or from the sea alone, but we do have partners on the ground in Yemen, and we ought to restore that relationship and, again, provide them the capacity and capability necessary to do it. In other words, be better at the game that the Islamic Republic and the Quds Force have been playing against us for some time. The easiest thing to do in the Middle East is find someone to fire a weapon at someone else. In fact, it's the natural state. All we have to do is find our partners on the ground to combat our adversaries, and we'd all be better off.
Thank you so much, Robert. And, you know, talking about this conference, about the panel, we're not just talking about the problems, we're also talking about the solution. So thank you for that. So moving on to Iraq now. Since the fall of Saddam Hussein, Iran's influence in Iraq has grown. How does this affect Iraq's ability to maintain sovereignty, and what are the broader implications for Iraqi domestic politics? Does anyone want to start this off?
I'll start with Iraq. So what's interesting about Iraq is it was Iran's lifeline during maximum pressure. Everything that Iran needed, it could get from Iraq. It could get Iraq to smuggle oil and gas out. It could charge Iraq more money for watermelons than, you know, to compensate for things. Anyway, so what's happening in Iraq, and we're at the point where we have U.S. forces inside of Iraq that are there to counter the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, right? ISIL or ISIS. And yet the biggest threat they face are Iraqi militias, the Hashd al-Shabi. And the militias are being funded by the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Interior, which are being funded by the United States. So we have all these levers that we could put in place to disfavor Baghdad, to punish the political parties tied to Tehran. You know, if I parachuted into northern Iraq, it would be the people that would save me from the government. If I parachuted into southern Iraq, it would be the Shia protesters that would protect me from the government. You know, if you parachuted into Iran, it would be the people that would save you from the regime. So we have allies on the ground. What we don't have are credible allies in Qatar, in Iraq. Jordan is an ally in need, on the brink of, you know, falling. And the Iraqi militias are no longer looking at U.S. forces inside of Iraq as much as they're looking at how weak Jordan is and how to open up a third front. And that's what's really concerning, because, as I said in my first statement, we cannot rely on the Iraqi military and the Iraqi special operations forces that we helped train and get to a point where they could take on high-value targets. Because if we had a meeting with them and said that they needed to take out you know, Abu Fadak, the leader of Kitab Hezbollah, or the deputy commander of the Hashd al-Shabi, within minutes, Kitab Hezbollah would know that there was going to be a raid because it would be leaked out because they're either complicit, terrified, or like-minded. We don't know. There are good people, and one of the biggest problems that we have is that we'll sit across from good people and ask them to do very difficult things, and they'll nod their heads and they'll say yes, and then we leave the room. And when we leave the room, that trust, even though it's there, what people need to do very difficult things is proximity and frequency. The more they can reach out and touch you, the more you're there to respond to something, the more likely they are to do difficult things. And I feel that we have lost Iraq, and we don't need to, and we could easily reverse that. We have allies in the Sunni provinces of Iraq, we have allies in the Kurdish north, less so in the Suleimania area with the PUK, Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. You know, when I was in Iraq, my name was Naqib Barzani, Captain Barzani, because I worked with the KDP in Mosul in 2005 against Al-Qaeda. Had no idea that Shia militias existed until I went to Baghdad. But I just fear that we've lost our, you know, what Rob and David said, we've lost our ability to push people in a direction, whether it be sanctions or the threat of kinetic force. We believe we can have a 2-hour conversation with somebody wearing a suit in DC and change their minds. And anybody who knows the culture, anybody who knows the region, is that I can sit across from somebody and ask them to do very difficult things, somebody in a suit, somebody in government, and they'll say, I understand your concerns. You're right, we need to do this, but we need more time, we need more money. And as soon as you hear those two phrases, it's the equivalent of an American politician telling you it's complicated, because that means nothing's going to happen.
If I might add, you know, I spoke earlier about some of the benefits of authoritarian states. In this case, this is another one with Iraq, and I'm not making the argument here that we should behave like this, but you know, if the United States doesn't like what you do and you are in Iraq and being pressured to do things favorable to the Iranian regime, et cetera, we will sanction you. And I sanctioned plenty of Iraqis in my day. But if the Iranian regime doesn't like what you're doing, they're going to kill you. And it gets real. It's a whole lot more intimidating. And so Iraq today, as Michael said, has about 100,000 men under arms in these militias that are backed by the Iranian regime. The Hashd gets funding from the central government, like $6.3 billion a year from the central government of Iraq. They also set up a corporation called the Mohandas Corporation, which is exactly what the IRGC has in Iran, and which is a revenue-generating corporation that gets contracts with the government. And they have missiles and drones that they periodically fire on Israel, Saudi Arabia, U.S. forces on Kuwait, U.S. forces in Jordan. Incredibly dangerous. I think every day, Iraq looks more and more like Lebanon. This enormous militia that is out of the government's control, that benefits financially from the state, parasitic relationship with the state in many ways, but also dominates the state. This is not, this is, I think, reversible. It is reversible, but not without a great effort by the United States.
Thank you, gentlemen. And is this on? There we go. There we go. So this is all really leading up to what's going on right now. Every news network's covering this. I know this very well because we're covering it every day. The Israel-Hamas war, the shadow war that Iran is really sort of puppeteering, right, on this world stage between Israel, Hamas, as well as other countries in the Middle East. So can we talk about the shadow war here. You know, the first attack from Iran was April 2024. They had sort of hidden the shadows before that. And Tehran's alliances, we know, with groups like Hamas as well as Islamic Jihad do serve Iran's strategic interests, as we have been discussing. So what is Iran's role here really to disturb peace efforts concerning the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
I'm happy to take the first one. As David mentioned earlier, the purpose of the Axis resistance, beginning with the crown jewel of the first among equals, Hezbollah, was to create a proximal deterrent. They recognized after the Iran-Iraq war they would not be able to stand toe-to-toe, and yet this asymmetric potential existed, and they labored effectively. And I'd have to say, too, that having dealt with all of them, that their proxies are far more effective than they are themselves. It's much easier to address the Iranians and the Quds Force in particular than their surrogates. Their surrogates are always more effective. But the Axis existed for its deterrent value. But I think conversations that go back several years between, I think, Nasrallah and Qasem Soleimani and others started to consider using it in an offensive way, but it would be dependent upon an opportunity to do it in a reason. And I think that ultimately came. We saw it in October the 7th, but in my judgment, the decision was made when the opportunity presented itself. I don't think in Tehran the Supreme Leader ever envisioned he would have two simultaneous windfall opportunities, one in which the United States would not only be unwilling to use force to prevent, deter, or attack them directly and impede their nuclear weapons program, and second, when Israel might not be able to do it or willing to do it, and that I don't think they ever envisioned. And in that time period of the last 3.5 years, I think they made a decision to employ the Axis offensively for a couple of reasons. First, because they could. Second, because the idea was to neutralize Israel, and with the United States having done so voluntarily, they could then complete the weaponization program without impediment. And in fact, and probably accurately, it is viewed in the region, the United States is essentially paying for Iran to complete the nuclear weapons program by allowing them access to windfalls and revenues by not enforcing sanctions, which we already mentioned. So I think the Axis is now being employed offensively and incrementally. Is it happening the way it was originally envisioned? Nothing ever does. Is it happening as fast or as quickly? No, but is it accomplishing the objective to neutralize Israel and to prevent the United States from taking effective action against Iran directly? I think the answer is yes. What happens next? I think miscalculation. Ultimately, the risk increases. The next few months will be among the most dangerous the Middle East has seen since at least 1979, but probably before that. And that's, I think, now more widely recognized. And it is because there is no American leadership. There is no credible deterrent. It's all been dismantled. Israel is fully occupied. Now certainly with Hezbollah, and look, the array of threats opposed against us without the United States in support puts us in a place in which the Islamic Republic has a momentary advantage. But as it often does, I think it overplays its hand and puts itself on the horns of its own dilemma. I think in the end, it's going to confront an array of threats that it is incapable of handling, but we're not at that point yet. So the shorter answer to your question is, I think the next several months are going to be among the most dangerous if they don't effectively test a nuclear weapon before a new administration hopefully comes to the United States. Then I think we have the hope of a new administration reversing course and concluding what was started in the first term.
Thank you so much. And I know, David, you were talking about the use of drones and missiles. If we can just circle back to that, because that's kind of a big point of this, Iran, how powerful are they really, with their defense systems, with their military weapons? So how do missiles and drones, these technological advancements, really just alter regional security dynamics in the area, and what can be done to counter them?
I think Michael's the weapons guy, but what I'll tell you is that, these have really changed, I think, entirely the dynamic in the region. The United States doesn't have a good answer for drones. We can shoot them down, use a $50,000 or $100,000 rocket or missile to shoot down a $5,000 drone, right? We don't have great counter drone technology in place and widely dispersed among our partners and even ourselves. And so Iran produces these, and actually they export them, right? Who would have thought that the theocracy would become the significant arms provider to Russia, right? To be in a position where they can just pump out all these missiles and drones, killer drones, to send to Russia to kill Ukrainians. And these are a problem that we are dealing with in the Middle East and actually around the world. This is low cost, easily, easily produced, and easily operated. And we don't have an answer for that just yet that is economical.
We have to look at, what Israel was able to do after that April strike. Israel was able to launch or conduct an attack inside of Iran in its most sensitive area, the Natanz area, with a weapon that Iran couldn't counter. It was the equivalent of somebody sneaking into a well-guarded house and taking a selfie, climbing in bed with an adversary, taking a selfie and posting it on social media, and then leaving the house undetected. I say that because Iran's attacks are face-saving gestures. They're off-ramping gestures. That 200 missile, drone, cruise missile attack was meant to be defeated, and it was easily defeated. And it was only the debris from one of the missiles that actually killed one Bedouin girl. If you look at the fail rate of the drones inside of Ukraine, it's about 30% fail rate. Inside of Gaza, when they launched from Rafah, of the 10,000 rockets that they fired from Rafah into Israel, 1,750 fell within Gaza, killing civilians. And again, we believe the lie when Hamas puts it out that Israel conducted an attack, much like the Shifa hospital. But when it comes to Iran's capabilities, they'll fight to the last Arab, right? The Islamic Republic of Iran is built for bipartisan condemnation, not only for the export of terrorism against our allies, against U.S. forces. To Rob and David's point, we keep shooting down the arrows, but we're unwilling to shoot the archers. We have to start hitting the archers because that's where you deter. You saw what Israel did in the port of Haida, right? Is that huge explosion that basically took out a huge percentage of their oil revenues with one strike sent a message. That strike that I talked about in Natanz sent a message. The pager attack sent a message. And what I left out before is only leaders carry pagers, handheld radios, and cell phones that are given to them directly by the Islamic Republic of Iran. So Iran's weapons capabilities is just like David said and Rob said, that Hezbollah is their deterrent. Hezbollah is their premier proxy on the ground, and it's getting decimated. The leaders that are so close to Nasrallah have been killed. If you look at the hierarchy, if you look at the chain of command, people that he depended on, they're no longer there. And that is something that should not be condemned. It's something that should be maximized. And we don't have to get militarily involved, but we should put a big media spotlight on what's not only going on with this war, but also what's going on inside of Iran. Again, the use of terrorism to go after a population that simply wants to live in freedom. And someone said it, I think from this group about a year ago at a dinner, said that if the regime made the hijab no longer mandatory, the regime would collapse. That's how weak this regime is. It needs a spotlight on it. It needs condemnation. It's built for bipartisan condemnation based on how they treat minorities, how they treat people from the LGBTQ community, how they treat anyone who disagrees with the regime. And yet somehow we continue to court it, we continue to reward it, we continue to appease it. And if we wanted to stop this war now, we should put extreme pressure on Iran. Until Iran feels pain, this war will continue. We have to remember what happened on October 8th. Hamas knew they would have support in academia, in our political system, in our media. And our administration, the day after October 7th, started to defend Iran, started to distance Tehran from October 8th, saying they were not responsible for this. They continue to reward Tehran for its export of terrorism, that continue to protect it. And I don't know why that is. Our adversaries should fear any president. They shouldn't just be worried about a Republican one.
You know, we have a little bit of time left. I was wondering if we had time for one audience question as well. If we want to take one question.
Yeah, we'll take
Yes?
one question. We have
Okay,
one
great.
question submitted. It is directed towards anyone on the panel. If the Islamic Republic fell and a secular democratic regime took its place and immediately cut funding for all terrorist proxy groups, how would regional countries react, and would they welcome Iran as a partner?
Take a quick stab at if I understood the question correctly, is if there was new management in Tehran, how would the rest of the world and the region respond? I think with a massive sigh of relief. And again, looking back to what the history is, I don't think we ought to be naive and assume that everyone's going to get along fine. That's just not, I think, the likelihood. But the change in the region would be so significant as to be difficult to overstate the importance of it. The principal threat to the region is the activities and the conduct and policies of the Islamic Republic, enabled, unfortunately, by others executing bad policies. If that were reversed and we had new management, I think it's impossible, again, to overstate the value. I think the region would welcome it, and I think we would be able to build on the foundation of the Abraham Accords and establish not just favorable economic ties between countries in the regions, including those perhaps in Tehran, but also to rebuild an enduring regional security architecture to protect and defend the region and global trade. So I think that would be the pivotal moment. And again, this is the principal threat, and absent that threat, you're looking at new horizons and real peace and prosperity, and the prospects for it, I think, become tangible and manifest, and let's hope that that's what happens.
Thank you so much. Anyone else?
Amen.
Mic drop. And how about you?
I think the gentleman from Texas spoke too long.
One last question here, if we want to just wrap this up as well. That was a great question. We know Iran's regional activities have far-reaching impacts, including on the global energy market. So how does Iran's behavior influence global economic stability, and what role should international organizations play in addressing these challenges? If I can just get a quick response from that. I know there's a lot of ground to cover, and we could go on about this for a while.
So, listen, I could dare say that Iran basically is a destabilizing force, and this has a pernicious impact on economic development, on foreign direct investment, on markets in the region, instability, energy markets, and of course, intra-regional trade. Because you have camps, you have countries that are friendly with the Islamic Republic and others that are terrified and won't want anything to do with it. So neighbors don't trade with each other. There are breakdowns along certain lines. They're really just a negative factor. And whether international organizations, well, certainly not the UN. Nothing positive. Are there international organizations that could help? The ICC, the ICJ, maybe?
I think, it's the question, too, from the audience about the management, too. New leadership is just kind of underscoring all of this conversation and the rest of the day, too. It's about the people, it's about humanity, it's about how can we separate the government from the people, and what ways can we sort of navigate that really tricky, sticky situation of, what policies can we put in place for the government, and also help the people when that government is leading the country. So thank you so much, gentlemen, and thank you as well to the audience for your questions, and I think we're out of time.
Thank you.